So first off, thank you everyone for showing up. Day two of TGEX. Yesterday was a wonderful time, and we're hoping to have even more fun today. So a little bit of introductions. My name is Sebastian Galeen. I'm an officer here at Triton Gaming. I'm a fourth-year psychology major.
Hello, my name is Owen. I'm also an officer at Triton Gaming. I'm a first-year computer engineering major.
And we have two wonderful guests over from Supergiant. If you'd like to introduce yourselves.
Yeah, sure. My name is Dexter. I'm a platforms engineer at Supergiant Games. Also a UCSD alum, class of 2016.
You've been with us since the early days of Hades. Yeah.
Early days of Hades.
And hey, I'm Greg Kasavin. I'm creative director at Supergiant Games. I went to UC Berkeley, so kind of UCSD adjacent. And I've been with Supergiant through pretty much since the start through Bastion, Transistor, Pyre, Hades, and now we're working on Hades 2. So we've been around since 2009 as a small independent studio. We have a little over 20 people working full time, including people kind of all around the world at this point. And we kind of work on one big new game project at a time. It was 7 people at the end of Bastion, our first game. And all 7 of us are still there after all this time. We just kind of want to stick together for as long as we can, keep making games together, and see where that leads us. So we're excited to be here. Thank you for having us.
Awesome. So we're now going to start getting into some questions. Each of you are able to answer the question at any given time. But starting off, what do each of you do as your respective roles over at Supergiant?
So in my role, I'm kind of a generalist programmer, I would say. I mean, I do a lot of porting work. I also do some of our localization work. I work on the game engine and a lot of our internal tooling. So I kind of like to think of the customers of a lot of the work that I do as being a lot of the people on the team.
Right.
Doing a lot of the things that help support the making of Hades and the making of Hades 2 and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and it's we talk about like localization work a lot. It's one of those things that secretly is a huge amount of work as part of game development, because our Hades is in 10 languages in addition to English.
Yeah, 10 languages, and then maybe even 12.
At this point it's even more. So it's all and it turns out all languages are different. So
Turns out there's
introduces some complications.
Sure.
Yeah, and in my case, I do writing for our games. So writing the stories and then putting the words into the games themselves, and doing the kind of narrative design and scripting, and work on the design of our games in general, among other things. And since we are a relatively small team, it's one of those things where we get to wear a lot of different hats. That's part of the fun. So we get to dabble in a lot of things.
Yeah. And adding on to that, since you guys have both very unique roles that are very distinct to each other, how do you guys work together and combine that in a workplace setting?
Yeah, we can. As mentioned, we work really these days. We work really closely together day to day on localization type stuff. Just a lot of. The original Hades game had more than 300,000 words in it, and that was a lot of words to translate. So both Dexter and I work closely with our translation teams, both to get all the words translated to begin with, and then actually get them in the game and displaying correctly, and all that sort of stuff. And then playtests come around. Everybody at the studio gets involved in playtesting and giving feedback on what we're working on, that sort of thing.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, I think we were kind of a hybrid studio, I'd say, as far as remote and on-site prior to the pandemic, and we've kind of continued to be hybrid. So a lot of the work that I do is generally from home, but occasionally office. For things like console work, you're probably going to need to have a developer kit and sort of set up a little home office kind of thing. I mean, Greg and I obviously work very closely together on the localization, so while Greg will be writing the text, once he's written the text and integrated in the game, I kind of do everything after that to make sure, the text boxes are rendering properly, that there's bold text in places, underlining, that the subtitles are properly connected to the VO that plays in the game, that they're appropriately getting turned into identifiers for all of the translators so that they can make sure that the game is appropriately translated in every single language. And there's all sorts of different quirks as far as linguistic differences between languages, which creates a ton of technical problems. But in short, it's pretty interesting work for sure.
Okay. So, kind of as like a tangent off of that, you mentioned that, there's like a lot of a disconnect between like the two different languages pretty much, like the coding language and the spoken language that we, we interact with. So what kind of problems, what's the biggest problem that you've run into, like trying to link those two, the bridge?
Oh, the bridge between like coding and kind of the content side of the game?
Yeah.
Or, yeah, so it's interesting because I think a lot of people, when they think of game programming, they think of like you're implementing like features to like, oh, like this is how the attack works or whatever. But like a lot of that, and that is a large part of game programming, but there's also an entire like world of like engine programming. There's budgeting for like, oh, how big can a map be? Like the artist will make a map as beautiful and as large as they possibly want. But you eventually have to hit, if you want to hit a 60 FPS, frame rate target, right? You need to make sure that you are keeping your asset sizes and things within a reasonable amount so that you can target the PC or whatever your minimum spec is. So I look at coding as both being a way to build the game, but also a way to support the underlying quality of the game by making sure that it has the technical underpinnings to be something that I'm proud of shipping, something that we're proud of shipping, and make sure that people are like happy with the game from a technical perspective, right? Because like, I used to do some work on the support side, and it's like when you get support tickets in, it's like it always kind of like hurts a little bit. You're like, oh man, there's like a bug in there, like shoot, or like something doesn't work on this graphics card, and like man, but we really try to make sure that the game is in as good of a state as possible for that sort of stuff, and I hope that it shows in our work.
Yeah. No, it's so complicated, right? At this point, there are different game systems, whatever, Nintendo Switch, PlayStation, Xbox, you name it, and then basically a near infinite number of PC configurations, graphics cards,
Absolutely.
CPUs, RAM, all that kind of stuff, and it's easy to, you play a game, it just works on your PC. It's easy to expect that is how it should always go, and you should expect that as a game player. However, it takes
It's easier said than done.
Yeah, it takes a lot for teams to support an infinite number of PC configurations. It turns out.
For sure, and then sometimes PC can, there's new stuff out like the Steam Deck and whatnot,
Right.
which is like changes a lot of things as well. I should also clarify we have a custom in-house engine as well, so a lot of the energy engineering stuff that you would get from like an Unreal or Unity, like we don't directly benefit from a lot of that stuff, and so because we're small and scrappy, like we have to keep our engine very very stable and very tailored to the kinds of games that we make, which I think helps us strategically as a studio, but it also makes sure that like we can continue to deliver games at the quality that we want to and that our players expect us to.
Right? Yeah, Dexter, you mentioned it briefly, but Dexter works a lot on the tools that our content creators, our artists, our designers use to build all the stuff that's in our games, and like tools are one of those things where at some big studios it can be hard to get engineering resources on tools because they already have tools. Why make new tools or why improve tools? Because we've already shipped games with these in the past. But for us, as a relatively small team, the tools we use are so essential because if our artists and stuff are bashing their heads against their tools, not able to kind of get their work done as efficiently as they want, it's just we can't get anything done as quickly as possible. So having our own tech and tools has been really, really great in that way, and we could our tools are often like a drop everything type of priority. It's like if an artist is having trouble, that's like a huge
red flag.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
Off,
Yeah, it's a big deal for us. So we try to fix it right away so that they can work as quickly as their minds allow.
Yeah. So as you've developed games over like the past decade, how has like working from like Bastion, Transistor, and Transistor to like Hades, like what were like some specific things that you learned from each game, and like how did you build upon it?
Yeah, I mean, a thing we've said is that each of our games has been made kind of in response to the game before it, even though it may not be evident in the games themselves. We've definitely taken what we've learned from each one and moved it forward, kind of try to build on it with the next one, or try to kind of evolve from it in the next one. And it would take a really long time to recap all those things, but I guess in the broadest strokes, Transistor was our second game after Bastion, and the main thing we were trying to see that we could do with Transistor was like, can we do it again? Can we make a whole new kind of world and a whole new game experience that felt original and fresh for the second time, having done it once with our first game, Bastion? We could have just made a Bastion 2 or something like that as our second project, but we had so many other ideas, and we wanted to kind of branch out and see what else that we could do. And we learned a lot as a team through the course of that. We started with the full team at the beginning of that project, whereas the team kind of grew to its full size over the course of Bastion. So it had a much longer pre-production. We spent a long time figuring out what Transistor was even going to be before making it. And then with Pyre, our third game, we kind of branched out even more. We wanted to give ourselves the freedom to explore in a lot of different directions, whereas with Transistor, it had like a rather kind of painstaking pre-production where we're going for something. We kept going for something kind of more specific, whereas with Pyre, we wanted to branch out and kind of put everything together and see where that led. And then with Hades, that was when we deliberately, having made 3 original games before Hades, we kept kind of starting over from scratch on each one, and we kept sort of resisting trying to use ideas from our previous games because we were so concerned with trying to make each game just stand truly on its own and feel unique. But now we're like 10 years in or something, is starting off on our 4th game, and we thought about all the things we loved doing with our previous games, and we're like, why are we not allowing ourselves to do any of these things? So we wanted to combine the best ideas from our past games into something new, and so we took kind of the action-packed aspects of Bastion, and we took the like atmosphere and the combat depth of Transistor, and we took the character-driven storytelling of Pyre and mashed them all together, and that became Hades. Hades was still really, really different for us because it was a game designed for early access, and it was a roguelike game, which we'd never done before, a game where you're like, you're starting over each time you die, essentially, and the story's moving forward no matter what. And then, of course, it was based on Greek mythology as opposed to being a totally kind of original setting, as with our first 3 games. So I think with each of our games, we've tried to kind of put ourselves out of our comfort zone. We've tried to do something that's a little bit scary for us, and that continues now with Hades 2 as our first ever sequel, and having to consider a lot about what goes into, what does it take to make a good sequel? What do our favorite sequels do, and what are the sequels that disappointed us do? Why don't we feel as good about those? And a lot of thought about that, and thinking about how we could grow this universe that we've worked on for so long and also love so much. So that that's recapping a lot of time since 2009, but those are the big things that come to mind.
Yeah, not having been from the original OG days, but the OG Hades days. It seems like I've done a little bit of work on sort of ports for Bastion and Transistor, especially Transistor on the Switch, sort of when I started in like 2018, which I guess Hades was in pre-production around that time, and so we were sort of working on sort of 2 different things in parallel, like, okay, can we get our engine to like work on the Switch? So I was like kind of doing some of that work, and then once Transistor Switch, finished and shipped, it's like I moved back onto Hades when early access kind of started going through, and that was its own process of like learning as well, because like the studio had never done an early access game before, and I had never really worked on an early access game before, and what is that going to look like from a scheduling perspective, and like are we going to be delivering enough for players, or like are we going to ship an update and then people will play everything in like a few days, and then oh no, like are we worried about? So those kinds of things were the things we worried about originally, or things I worried about at least originally during the process. And I think as we moved on through the game, we realized we could kind of take a little more time with our updates, and we could kind of add a lot more stuff and make the game in a way that was healthier for us and allow us to deliver more. So I think throughout the experience of shipping Bastion, Transistor, and Pyre, and then working through Hades Early Access, that's informed a lot of how we're developing Hades 2 as well. So I think we just continue to learn from our previous endeavors.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so much, as you're saying, so much changed in terms of how in terms of our day-to-day development with what we learned through Hades Early Access, and so. Yeah, the time goes fast, and we've just kept learning how to make games well together. It's like this kind of never-ending quest for us, and we've wanted to see, just how long we can keep it going for. Our ambition is quite modest in that regard. That we just want to keep making games together, for as long as we can, for as long as our players continue to enjoy them.
Yeah, so being game devs, I know that it kind of changes the way that you look at games. As a gamer and as a game dev, it's like two different views. When you're playing a game, you're going through the story, you're going through the gameplay, but as a game dev, you're looking like, oh, there's boundary break areas. That's definitely easy to, manipulate the game. How does that affect how you view games in general, both as like being a game dev and being a gamer?
Yeah. They're still, for me at least, they're still like, games are still very much magical. Part of me hoped that by now, I got into game development at the beginning of 2007. So, but I still feel like I'm new to it, in the sense that when I play whether it's like a Last of Us Part 2 or whether it's like Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, I play those games and it's like, how do they do this? It's the different ways in which different studios specialize, and the things that they're able to accomplish in terms of what they focus on are still dazzling to me very, very frequently. So I do have that experience for sure, that sometimes it's like, oh, I see what they're doing. I see how they made this. I understand, this is a clever trick. This was an effective little moment, and I know how we could do this little thing that they did. So that happens to be sometimes when I play stuff, but just as often I play stuff, it's like, oh man, there are a lot of really talented teams out there.
Yeah, I'm thinking about Elden Ring, and just every time I was like, if the game makes me want to stop playing and start screenshotting everywhere, I'm like, yeah, okay, it still hits. This is for sure something. I've noticed that as I've switched more into game dev, one thing I didn't used to do before is I'll go into the options menu and I'll go to the credits as soon as possible. I'm like, who made this? Which when I was a player, I kind of didn't really think about that as much. But now I'm like, wait, who are my peers? Who are the people who are making this stuff?
Yeah.
And who is how are they making things?
Right.
Because some of this stuff just amazes you from a technical perspective, from an artistic perspective. It's just an appreciation for what games as a medium can do. It's just
And it's interesting. One of the I think very unique things about games as a medium is they're so they're totally kind of formless. If you think about you can have smaller independent movies that are made by smaller teams, or a music band that has 2 members as opposed to a 15-piece band or something like that. But I think with games, the range of team sizes is even kind of wilder than any of those other formats, where you have Papers, Please or something made by one person onto these productions that are over 1,000 people in size.
Yeah.
So just looking through the credits and seeing where does this team even kind of put their resources? Do they have 20 programmers? Do they have 20 artists or something like that? It's really there's no kind of one right
No one
configuration
solution.
of a
Exactly.
team.
Yeah, it depends on like the kind of game,
Yeah.
right? And the kind of studio that they have, right? I imagine FromSoft is like tons of animators.
Yeah,
Tons
exactly.
of animators, right?
Right. How do they make
And
all
artists.
those wild, creatures that any one of those things,
The
like
unique
most
combat,
studios
yeah.
can't make even one of those things, and they'll have 150 whatever
Exactly.
unique bosses or something.
particular things. Yeah, it's amazing. Totally amazing.
Yeah. So, throughout your personal life, like, what were some like inspirations that you had that like ended up driving you to become a game developer, not just like stay as a gamer and just like enjoy the content?
It's funny because game development for me started at a really kind of early age, sort of accidentally, because my parents weren't super into video games, and so I kind of had to like trick them into letting me play video games by like, you go to the Scholastic Book Fair and you could get like a CD-ROM of like Roller Coaster Tycoon 2, and I was like, see, it's educational,
Yeah.
right? It's like physics and math, like I can play this game, right? So I get games like. It's funny because I think about that of like how every game I've worked on has been isometric, purely
Yeah.
just through happenstance. But like, oh yeah, Roller Coaster Tycoon 2. The reason why I loved that game and why it kind of inspired me to become a game dev is because you get that diamond shape and you build your park and you build it all the way to the outside. And I'm like, well, why can't I just keep making it bigger? Like I just want to make a game where I can just keep making the sandbox
yeah.
even larger and larger and larger. So I kind of just typed into Google. I was like, game maker. And then I found Game Maker when I was like 12 years old. And I was like, oh, okay, this is cool. And then I was off to the races at that point. And then later on, and around high school, that was when Bastion came out. And I was like, oh, people can like be independent game developers. Like that's a thing that exists. I was like, oh, that's cool. And so I was following Supergiant Games ever since then, and just through a series of strange circumstances, I ended up at Supergiant.
That's awesome. Yeah, the Roller Coaster Tycoon is a great game. Yeah, for me, it's an old. I've wanted to make games since I was a little kid. Playing an old computer role-playing game called Ultima 4, and the Ultima series is like any modern computer role-playing game, like whether it's Dragon Age or Witcher, like or Skyrim or any of that kind of. Skyrim isn't modern, but they all owe to the Ultima series as like, and so as a little kid is playing this game that was a whole big world, and your choices have consequences. You could go wherever you want, rob shopkeepers, be kind or be cruel, and all this kind of stuff. And the game feeds back on your choices. And for me, it was just like it was mind blowing. And I had a vague sense that like a small number of people made this thing that was like a whole world. So that was incredibly inspiring to me. And I just loved, both arcade games and RPGs, just kind of everything. So it was always a part of my life. So I just always wanted it to be, I always wanted to get involved with it. And I got to writing about games for a long time because I struggled with like programming them. So I worked as an editor at a website called GameSpot for more than 10 years before I finally got my chance to get into game development. So then, I didn't get my shot at working on games until like my late 20s or something like that. So I had my own weird roundabout path of getting in. And then it took, in Bastion, I started working at Electronic Arts then, and a couple of the guys on the large team I was a part of were Gavin Simon and Amir Rao, later co-founded Supergiant. They were friends of mine from EA, so we all ended up working together on Bastion and so on. So it took working closely with a couple of my friends to finally get a shot at writing stories for games, building levels, all that kind of stuff that I always dreamed of since my early Ultima days.
So going back a little bit and talking about like childhood and everything, where do all of your inspirations for your games come from? I know Bastion and Transistor, Pyre, Hades, and Hades 2, they all have that isometric style, but they all have like a different story. So it's like you're using almost like similar gameplay in a way, or at least visual style. But where does your inspiration for all of that come from?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, the inspiration question, it's like, it's always a tough one because it's very, for our team, it's very personal, to the point where we don't even, like, often we don't even talk about our inspirations in that way. There's no, we make our games in a very, like, collaborative way to where it isn't just like one person saying, you know, we're making this game, and you must all, you know, the rest of you must all be part of my particular vision, and this game is about, you know, my experience with this one thing, and you all get to be a part of it. And instead, it's everybody who's involved gets to bring their own personal inspirations to bear, whatever they may be. So the inspirations, you know, for each of our individual artists, like you could go down the list of everyone who works at Supergiant, and their answers to what their inspirations are going to be like very different. So there isn't necessarily like a shared, and even when it comes to games that that influence or inspire us, which of course there are many, it's never just like it's never like this meets that. You know, we're going for these particular games. It's always just kind of a weird you know, mashup of different ideas together. So for me, I mean, it's just. I don't even know where to start. It's so many games, but other media and life experiences and all sorts of different things combined. Like with you know, with Hades, one of the things that we gravitated toward was like, it's this kind of family story, right, told through the perspective of the underworld and these Olympian gods. And many of us at the studio, we found that we had like similar shared stories about our upbringing. Like a number of us are were either immigrants to this country or are like first generation in this country. So we grew up with parents who weren't necessarily, you know, from originally from the United States. And we found that no matter where we came from, we had some kind of similar background where you know, the parents were under a lot of pressure. They were kind of struggling to make ends meet for their kids and stuff, and those kind of experiences actually informed aspects of Hades, of the story in Hades. But I don't think that is obvious when you play it, because it's not like overtly this kind of immigrant story. But I personally think of it that way, because Hades isn't originally from the underworld himself. He had to move there to take a job. So things like that. That's like an example of how inspiration can manifest in some, I guess, like relatively subtle ways in our games. But making them personal was like what we wanted. We wanted we wanted to be a small team where everyone can like put themselves into the kind of games that we make.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have too much to add to what you just said, other than I've found that there's a lot of diversity among the games that we all play in the studio. So, you know, we have some people who like action games. We have people who love visual novels. You know, all of that experience through the breadth of the team and all of our interests and all of our personalities and life experiences, I think have all shaped Hades and shaped Hades 2. I mean, like, as a strange example, like in high school I took Latin because like I was tongue-tied, so I was afraid I couldn't roll my R's, so I took Latin, and then that ended up having me translate like Ovid's poems about Orpheus and Eurydice, and then when I started working, I was like, hey, Greg, we're gonna do Orpheus in the game, but like, what's Eurydice is in the underworld, right? Like,
no, that's true. I remember
that. And then Eurydice ended up being in the game. So I mean, stuff like that is just that strange butterfly effect of like, how would that happen? Well, dude, it just happened, you know?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, you never know where those little things will come into play. Even just, for me, similarly, the part where we ended up doing a game based on Greek mythology, I never necessarily would have guessed. And that just, you know, that ended up being a thing where enough people on team were like, had that shared interest to where we decided to pursue it, because it's never just about one person, you know, wanting. If we try to look for those game ideas that the most people at our studio are the most excited about pursuing, because that's how we're going to end up with the best result when people do have that like spark of inspiration.
And we're going to be
for it.
spending a lot of time working on
Yeah,
it, right?
exactly.
So it's like we
You're-
have to be confident in what we're doing and feel like it's going to be good.
Yeah,
right?
it has its
So-
ups and downs for sure. You know, game development can be grueling. It takes a long time. So like, it's so important to be really excited about the thing that you're making at the beginning, because that excitement won't always be
Won't always be
10
at
out of 10
maximum. Yeah.
exciting when
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
like dealing with certification
or
bugs
whatever, or bugs
yeah.
or crazy stuff, when deadlines start happening. But
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it's good to have that baseline and be like, all right, the thing that we're making, we're confident in
Yeah.
it, or we feel like it's going to be good. That really can help you.
A mix
in
of
the valleys.
yeah,
a mix of fear, but
yeah,
a
healthy dose
mix.
of
Yeah.
fear, as I was mentioning before, of just being a little bit of like, how are we going to do that? Like we've never done that before. That's part of excitement. If it's too familiar, it's hard to be as excited about it before than something that is like fresh and different to us. So
Yeah.
we've definitely looked for that each time in our own way.
The choice to do early access is an example
Yeah.
of that for something. Yeah.
Super scary, because we
Yes.
were accustomed to making
Absolutely.
games just kind of heads down, just do our own thing for a while. You come up for air when you announce a game, and then one more time when you release it. But early access has this more almost like it's just so public. You're getting like feedback on unfinished work. It's so scary to put your work out there even when you think it's done, much less when it's like in progress. So that was a big adjustment for us, but was so integral to how Hades turned out. So that was an example of something that scared us in a good way, I think, and turned out really well.
All right, so for this second portion of the panel, we'll be opening the floor to audience to ask questions.
Yeah, any questions?
Any questions?
Any questions?
So I had a question about like kind of the collaborative nature
Yeah.
of your studio as a whole. You mentioned you had like a few friends that came from the EA, if I'm correct. And I was like wondering how, when you were all starting as a studio, how you kind of like came to form the structure,
Mhm.
and also like how you basically like ended up developing like how your studio operates and how everyone gets to contribute to the overall.
Yeah. So, yeah, great question. So the question is about how and correct me if I'm wrong. It's about kind of how did we come to have our particular studio? How do we collaborate, and how do we come to be our particular configuration of team members? With the number of programmers and designers and artists and what have you. How did we evolve to be that way? And the short answer is we grew into it. One of the things for us is that it's really important to us that we make what we can make right now with the resources that we have. And while that may sound rather obvious, I think for a lot of studios, they approach it in a different way. Like they may imagine the game that they want to make, and then they start hiring people to fill those positions. Like, let's make a team-based multiplayer shooter. Okay, we're going to need a network engineer, and we're going to need artists and game designers and so on. But with Bastion, it started as just Amir Rao and Gavin Simon, and one's a designer and one's an engineer. So all they had were levels and programming, right? And then they're like, going to need an artist, going to need some audio. As those needs became very urgent, the original team took shape. But even things like if you've played Bastion, there's like narration is like a big part of that game. Even something like that was born of that mindset of what can we do with what we have. Logan Cunningham, who's the voice of the narrator in Bastion and is a major voice, he's the voice of Hades and like a ton of other characters in that game. But he's been our kind of main voice actor in all of our games. It's because Amir, knew him and knew Darren Korb, who's our audio director and composer. They've known each other since they were in middle school. So it's kind of like calling up a friend, and we could having this ambition to have like narrative be a part of the game, but realizing that one way we could execute it is through voiceover because we know this guy who has this great voice. So it's not in that chicken and egg process. It's like we know someone who has a great voice, so maybe we could use that in our game as opposed to like we need a good voice actor, where can we find one? And I think that mindset sort of continues with us to this day, where we're just trying to think about what we can do with what we already have before we grow the team at all, because staying small is really important to how we function, where we can just, we don't need a lot of documentation. We just talk to each other. Most of our documentation, doesn't exist in many cases because it's just people, passing on the information about our games verbally. And whereas big teams, it becomes, when you have a 1,000-person team, you make a change about the game you're making, that's a lot. You have to communicate to a lot of different people. And with us, we can do things kind of faster and looser in that way in terms of being small. So that's, the team, kind of gradually formed in that way. And the other analogy, the thing that Amir, who I've mentioned, would bring up sometimes, there's a movie called Sunshine. It's a solid science fiction movie about trying to save the dying sun. And there's a moment where they talk about how like it's not on the spaceship, it's not a democratic process. They're like a bunch of experts, so that let the expert decide. So we try to make it so that the person who has to do the work is the person who makes the decision. So when something comes to art, Jen, our art director, what do you say? What's it going to be? It's not like everybody can give input, but the person, when it comes to like anything that affects us individually, the person who has to do the work has like an outsized voice in that decision because they got to do it. So they're the best fit to figure out how to approach it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would only add to that with like the same thing with the engineering is like, hey, if you own this particular system, you own that system, right? If the artists want to add 1 million bushes to a level, we'd be like, hey, sorry, we've only got space for 1,000 bushes, but we can set some limits in some cases, but for the most part, the owner, like only when there's like hey, we have a hardware limitation, right? That's a technical thing. Other than that, it's pretty collaborative as far as like giving people input and responding to feedback, especially like play tests and that sort of thing. But when it comes to like, okay, we need to make a decision about something, about the direction of this game, about the direction of this biome or whatever, it's like the owners of that system are the best people to make that decision because they're the ones who are going to implement it. They're the ones who are going to test it the most. They're the ones who are going to build it and make sure that it's good, right? So their input is the most important. Yeah,
even things like scheduling, it's like, well, we have this amount of time, for example. What do you the artists determine how much they could do within it. It's not like it's not someone pushing the work onto other people. It's the individual kind of content creators deciding what they can do within the constraints of what they have, the people that they have, the time they have, etc. Yeah. Other question there? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you mentioned that for every single game you try to be as different possible, at least from the first 3 games.
Mm-hmm.
But they always come out and receive a very good public reception and everything. How do you ensure that a game which you have never made before and most likely there's nothing similar in the industry before come out in such good quality? Which part is most important? Is the game testing, the prototyping?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so the question is how do we ensure our games, turn out to be both, I guess, like distinctive, like different, as well as good, and we, it's we have to give them time. Is one of the most important aspects. You can't. It's a really tricky aspect of game development because you could spend like an infinite amount of time on any given aspect of your game, really. You could work forever on a single level. You know, Darren, I mentioned, he does our music. He could keep iterating on a piece of music until it's just perfect. I could keep working on a sentence for hours and hours and hours. But we have to decide to move on at some point. So having that judgment of when something is like good enough is really important. And that's like, I think that's very much like an ongoing, that's an ongoing process where we together as a team, we do have to play test a lot internally, discuss internally, and I think we reach a point where our notes on each other's work become things that are so small that start to be like imperceptible, and it's like, well, this is now extremely hard to address and also so subtle that maybe no one will notice, and that's a good time for, when we catch ourselves in those moments, we know that it's probably time to move on, you know, to the next thing. Now it's like serious diminishing returns kind of on our effort. And we do play test a lot. We don't make games we make games for our players. We don't make them just for ourselves. How we feel about them matters a lot, but how other people feel about them is what matters even more, I would say. And so we have to play test and see if our like intentions around the game are coming across to the player, or like, are people having the kind of experience that we thought that they might have, or are they getting really distracted or confused and things like that by things that we don't want to be distracting or confusing. So we look for those kind of issues, and we just try to like we try to focus on getting rid of those kinds of things. So the things that we do want to be important in the experience are the things that shine through. But it's never, you know, it never, we have no formula for this. It never ceases to be challenging and we never, if not for the playtesting, I don't think we would know if our work was kind of good enough at any given moment. So there's always that. I think all of us have to wrestle with some of that amount of fear of like, is this sufficiently good or not? And the only way to answer that is almost, scientifically. You like test the hypothesis. You know, you put it to other people, and if they all tell you it's good, then well, that's maybe as much confidence as we're going to get at any given moment. And even then, you have to then release it, and you still don't even entirely know for sure how good the thing is until you put it out there, and you don't really control you don't control what people are going to, you know, go on to say about it and stuff like that. You have no real way of knowing. So we feel extremely fortunate that our games have been as well received as they have been, and we don't ever take that for granted. Yeah.
I don't think I have much to add.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I think you covered it. Any more questions? In the back?
A couple more there.
So since starting in 2011 of Bastion up to now, the indie game scene has changed a lot, and you guys have remained very consistent. So, you guys have any like type of insight or I guess comments or opinions on like how the indie scene is now compared to back then?
Yeah, it's a great question for sure. Things have really changed around games. And they always do. You know, a lot of things change, and a lot of things also stay the same. Supergiant exists because like digital distribution of games started to be a thing in the kind of mid to late 2000s. There were these games like Braid and Castle Crashers and Plants vs. Zombies that were like early examples of like big independent hits that were made by small groups of people that were these fantastic, you know, they're fantastic games to this day. And they really inspired us to want to go and try things like that. And a lot of different trends come and go. There was a time when, you know, the iPad and stuff like that was taking off, and everyone, you know, started saying, oh, you know, consoles are going to go away and everyone's going to be playing games with, you know, with touch screens only and stuff like that. And it's partially true, but you know, people have been playing games with controllers now for what, like 40 years or something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
There are a lot of aspects of games that haven't changed, and so we've tried to we take so much inspiration from like classic games and the games we grew up playing that we think some of those fundamental things that made those like classic 8-bit and 16-bit games pleasurable to play then and now, that those things will never go out of style. So we don't get too like worried about like chasing the sort of trends du jour, and we think that it's that there will always be interest in again, kind of the fundamentals of video games, that there will always be new types of games, touchscreens, motion controls, whatever, that's fine, but then people will want to play games where you press a button and stuff happens. And we've focused on games like that, and that's not been, we're no closer to finding any limits to things that could be interesting there. So yeah, we just try to stick to our principles, and that hasn't served us wrong thus far. We also try to bring our games to a variety of platforms, right? Because we don't know what the future holds, and we don't know where people are going to be like playing games, 5 years from now or something like that. And when our games take 3 or 4 years to make, it becomes a tricky kind of, that's where a lot of Dexter's work comes in, making sure our systems are as kind of portable as possible. So if there's some game system that becomes huge, that our game, could potentially be there.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know. Handhelds are kind of hot right now. There's a bunch of them coming out. It's like, is handheld going to be the future? Or are people not going to be, PC gaming anymore? I don't think that's true, but
yeah.
Predictions, I don't know.
They kind of play games everywhere, right? It's like
Exactly.
we just want to be able to have our games be good, wherever games are being
games are
played.
Exactly.
Yeah, within reason. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there was another question back there.
Just as a more specific question, all your releases so far have been on the isometric style.
Yeah.
Do you consider that like a calling card of Supergiant, or would you be open or have like internally discussed maybe having a future release that is not isometric in style?
Yeah, no, we've considered, so Pyre, I actually don't really consider Pyre to be isometric. It's kind of more side view in a way, but we like the isometric perspective. Myself and Amir and Gavin, we worked together on real-time strategy games before Supergiant, which are traditionally from that viewpoint. Yeah, Dexter playing Roller Coaster Tycoon. So I think we have a lot of fondness for it. But there's no, when we were working on Transistor and stuff like that, and Pyre as well, we explored a lot of different things. So we don't have any like inherent. We don't see the like camera of our games necessarily as like something that's integral to the kind of stuff that we make. I think what's more core to our identity as a studio is the way that we're very interested in the intersection of like the play experience and the narrative like thematic experience. So we want to find those opportunities where the meaning of the game and the mechanics of the game come together, and we really value like the audio experience, voiceover music. That I have trouble imagining ever not being a big part of our games. Like those things are really important to us. But the exact like format and genre of our games, we like to keep our options potentially open. But who knows? We actually don't plan our. We have never known what game we would make next before being finished with the game before it. If that makes like we don't plan multiple games ahead or anything like that because our games are made in response to the one before, and so we have to consider sort of how we're feeling and things like that once we're finished with a particular project before moving on to the next one. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say to be, I guess, specific, we don't really have a meeting where we all get together and go, are we making an isometric game today? Like, it's not something like that. It's more of, as long as isometry sort of serves whatever it is whatever game at the core of the game that we're trying to make with the storytelling or the gameplay. Isometric is not really something I think we think about other than like how we're going to beautify the levels, for example, and the problems. I think we also have like a large internal knowledge of shipping so many isometric games that there's a little bit of a comfort to it, and we kind of sort of know the limitations and the sort of problems of isometry. So it's sort of a thing that we're kind of used to, but it's not something I think we're explicitly like, we're an isometric only studio.
Yeah.
Like it's never been that kind of a thought process. It's just like, if this is the way that, as long as this continues to serve the kind of games that we want to make, then sure. But if that changes, if we want to make a game that feels different, and then we might do that.
I just wanted to hear your thoughts on games being released too early or unfinished for the sake of meeting deadlines or set date expectations.
I would love to take this one.
Yeah.
I feel like I always want to go to bat for other developers, because I had a good friend of mine and a mentor whom I used to work with who told me something that I think sticks with me to this day whenever I see a game that ships, because what he said to me was that any game that ships is a miracle, and I think that's like just a truism as far as my experience in the industry. So to me, it feels like there are several different kinds of reasons why a game can be shipped in an unfinished state. But I always feel for the developers and the people who are on the ground working on that game, because I think it's hardly ever the case that the engineers, the artists, the designers who are playing the game, playtesting, QA, all of those people, they know what the game is, and I would generally point to higher levels of management or executive teams saying, hey, we got to make quarterly earnings, or we got to do this sort of thing, and we got to push the game out. If it's working, if it's not working, so be it. And I think that's sort of an unfortunate, a really tragic way of making games, because it really hurts the developers, it hurts their reputation, and you want to feel good about the work that you do. And so I guess I just want to be like, solidarity for the devs, because it's like, it's not really, it's their fault, but it's not always their fault. A lot of things can cause a game to fail. Sometimes a studio gets a project or gets an IP where, like, hey, they were working on one kind of game for a long time and they've shipped other things, but they've made a huge departure, and the internal way of, for example, like you were saying, like hiring to fill the game with the resources you don't have yet, and then trying to build something like that, I think can lead to failure as well.
They're
in some
using,
ways.
or they're
I mean,
using.
I say failure in a very like loose term. I mean, any game that ships is like not a failure in my view, because like, hey, getting a game out the door, printed, certified on console, like there's so much work for a game to just reach audiences that like it's really hard to like. Maybe I'm too far on the inside, but having done porting work, I'm like, I feel for you guys. Like, optimization is very, very difficult, and it's such a technically difficult thing to pull off, and sometimes it's understaffed.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's they didn't have enough time to get to it, and they knew that, and they had to ship because of who knows what sort of reasons.
Yeah, running game teams can be really expensive, especially if you have 1,000 people or whatever. So you have your budget, and sometimes you just don't have time to keep going. And I think you'll see online, it's like, oh, this game needed more time. I think sometimes it's more complicated than that. There are some games where more time, in my opinion, it wouldn't have helped them, because games become so complicated that it's like trying to complete a puzzle, but you're missing a couple of pieces. Like, you're never going to complete this puzzle. You just backed yourself into a corner, and you pursued an idea that to like untangle it, you'd have to almost kind of go back to the beginning or something like that. So sometimes you just have to finish what you started. And we've had that experience ourselves at Supergiant in our own way. Like, when we're working on Transistor and Pyre and games like that, we're halfway through. We're done with our pre-production, and we've kind of like, we know that this is what we're making, and we're still potentially pretty uneasy about some aspects of are people going to get this? Does this work? Does this make sense? Well, we're kind of all in on this. We just have to finish it, and let's take the time we need and try and finish it. But like trying to like fix every perceived flaw about the game is impossible. because someone can always be critical of something about it. So I think developers can also, while on the one hand, I totally agree that developers know what they're shipping, they know what the problems are. On the other hand, you do get so close to it that it's hard to have like totally clear perspective on it because you've been living, breathing it, for years in some cases, and you're not going to have the same perspective as just someone starting the game for the first time. And it's the other thing I just wanted to add is, as like I'm sure some of you in this room are thinking about game development yourselves, and I think that there is often more to learn from like flawed games that are less good than from the ones that are like extremely good and pristine. Because the ones that are extremely good and pristine, they're intimidating. You play them and like I was saying before, it's like magic. Like I have no idea how people made this. But when you play a game that's like so-called bad, you're like, it's less, you can see the kind of human fingerprints on it a little bit more. And you could see what they were going for. And sometimes the idea that the game was going for was really good. They just didn't quite pull it together. And there's so much to learn from things like that. So I'm a big fan of playing, games that are less like. There's so many highly reviewed games that are totally worth playing, but aspiring game developers should also play the less good games from time to time because there's even more sometimes to take away from those, I think.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree. Does that answer your question? Next question.
I think we have enough time for one last question. We are unfortunately getting close to our time frame.
Hi, I hope this question makes sense. But in Hades, the main character, like when the main character dies, that's like part of the story.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and the game rewards you for failing in a way, which is kind of a mechanic of roguelike games, but also just the idea of a game itself. So like, what do you think about like games that kind of take advantage of being a game, or like kind of break the fourth wall in a way? But like, what do you think about that? And like, would you consider doing more in the future, like with that kind of thing?
No, yeah, we the part using the roguelike format where you die and start over and keep going to tell a story was like one of the main things we wanted to do with Hades. So we were so happy that aspect of it ended up being generally well received, because we're looking for those opportunities to connect like the experience you're having as a player with what's actually going on in the story. And we're thinking about roguelike games. We have all of our different favorites, and we're thinking about what makes them work, but also what are some of the opportunities for that genre. And with games like that, what's so great about them is they're different every time you play. But one of the things that they do to be that way is they're often very hard. So you die brutally and often. But the tension is when games are really hard, it makes you not want to play anymore. That's when people rage quit out and forget this. This is too hard for me. So we we very intentionally kind of designed the story of Hades to help with that, to make you want to keep playing, to make you realize that failure is not just okay, but literally part of the experience. You're not doing anything. You didn't do anything wrong. It's part of the game to fail here. So it becomes part of the game design, but also part of the whole theme and the narrative. So we just actively search for those kind of opportunities and try to tell stories that are possible, that are uniquely possible through the format of the game that we're making. Because if all we wanted to do was tell a story, there are way more efficient ways to do that than trying to make a whole video game as well. You could write a book, because that's just the words. There's all the other stuff that goes into making a book, but you get the gist of it. So the story in our games, the narrative, is very much meant to be in service of the experience as a whole, and we look for those kind of concepts where the play, maybe you could imagine the story in some other format, but it wouldn't be the same if it was a movie or a book or something based on this story. We design it explicitly around the mechanics Yeah, so we look for that each time, really.
All right. Well, that is the end of the Supergiant panel. Thank you very much to
Thank
both
you.
of you for showing up. If you'd like to reintroduce yourselves and find where they can find your socials, if you'd like.
Yeah, I'm Dexter, platforms engineer. My Twitter handle is @AfroDynamics. If you are unfortunately like me, still on the Bird app.
Hey, and I'm Greg Kasavin. Yeah, and my Twitter is just my last name. So yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, we're around if you guys have other questions. Thank you very much for
Yeah, thank
showing
you for
up.
having us.
Thank you.